What if the greatest virtue in Les Misérables wasn't kindness at all? What if Victor Hugo was pointing toward something far more unsettling and far more important? Most people remember Jean Valjean as a good man. A compassionate man. A man who chose mercy when the world offered him very little of it. But that memory hides a deeper question, and once you see it, it becomes difficult to look at the story the same way again. Because kindness, by itself, is not actually that rare. History is filled with kind people. What is rare is transformation. What is rare is a human being who refuses to remain the person the world has already decided they are. And that is where the real mystery begins. Think about it for a moment. Why does Jean Valjean continue to fascinate readers almost 2 centuries later? Why does his presence feel larger than the events around him? Why does he seem to carry a weight that goes beyond a single novel? The obvious answer is morality. But what if the obvious answer is wrong? What if Valjean's true role in the story is not to represent goodness, but possibility? Because the most powerful thing about him is not that he becomes a better man. The most powerful thing is that he proves a person can become someone else entirely. And that idea is far more dangerous than it sounds. After all, every society depends on labels. Criminal. Citizen. Failure. Success. Outcast. Hero. Labels create order. They help us decide who can be trusted, who should be forgiven, and who deserves another chance. But what happens when a single person steps outside the label assigned to them? What happens when reality refuses to obey the category? Suddenly the problem is no longer one man. The problem becomes the system itself. And this is where Les Misérables quietly transforms from a story about an individual into a question about civilization. Because if one person can fundamentally change, how many others can? If the past does not permanently define a human being, then what exactly gives society the right to treat it as destiny? Notice the contradiction hidden at the center of the novel. The people who claim to understand human nature often believe people never change. Yet the entire emotional force of the story comes from the possibility that they do. That contradiction is not just literary. It is deeply personal. Many people spend their lives carrying invisible chains long after the visible ones are gone. Not chains around their wrists. Chains inside their identity. A mistake. A failure. A humiliation. A version of themselves they can never seem to escape. And maybe that is why Jean Valjean still matters. Not because he is morally perfect. Not because he is unusually kind. But because he stands as a challenge to one of the oldest assumptions in human history, that who you were is who you must remain. The memory fragment that echoes through the entire story is surprisingly simple. The most dangerous chain is not the one that binds your body. It is the one that lives in the minds of other people. And perhaps the most frightening question Victor Hugo leaves behind is not whether a person can change. Perhaps the real question is this: why are so many individuals, and so many institutions, terrified of what would happen if they truly could? But if Jean Valjean represents the possibility of transformation, then a more uncomfortable question immediately appears. Who, exactly, is threatened by that possibility? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. You might think the obstacle is prejudice, or fear, or simple human stubbornness. But Victor Hugo's insight cuts deeper than that. The real conflict is not between a man and his enemies. It is between two completely different views of human nature. One view says that people are fixed. The other says that people are unfinished. And the gap between those ideas is enormous. Because if human beings are fixed, then judgment becomes easy. The past tells you everything you need to know. A person's worst decision becomes their permanent identity. Every mistake becomes a life sentence of meaning. But if human beings are unfinished, everything becomes more complicated. Now you have to account for growth. Now you have to account for change. Now you have to admit that yesterday's truth may not be today's reality. And that is precisely where the deeper contradiction of Les Misérables begins. To emerge. Notice that Jean Valjean's greatest challenge is not simply escaping a past identity. It is surviving other people's certainty about that identity. That distinction matters. Because certainty feels like wisdom. Yet throughout history, certainty has often been the enemy of understanding. The moment we become absolutely convinced that we know who someone is, we stop paying attention to who they might become. And this is where another figure quietly enters the philosophical battlefield. Not as a villain. Not even as an evil man. But as something far more fascinating. A living idea. Javert represents a worldview. His role is not merely to oppose Valjean. His role is to defend a system of meaning. A system built on consistency. Order. Predictability. Rules. From that perspective, transformation itself becomes suspicious. Because if people can truly change, then certainty collapses. If people can truly change, then labels lose power. If people can truly change, then every judgment carries the possibility of being wrong. That is not just a personal problem. It is a civilizational problem. And suddenly the conflict expands far beyond two individuals. Now we are talking about courts, schools, governments, families, entire cultures. How should a society treat someone whose past and present no longer match? The question sounds philosophical. In reality, it is deeply practical. Every generation inherits invisible categories. Success. Failure. Worthy. Unworthy. Trustworthy. Dangerous. Most people spend years trying to live inside those categories. A few spend their lives trying to escape them. And that is where one of the most powerful memory fragments in this story begins to take shape. Imagine a prison record. Not as a document. As a shadow. A shadow that follows a person from room to room. Year after year. Long after the original event has ended. The remarkable thing about shadows is that they only survive when something continues to cast them. Which raises another mystery. What actually keeps the shadow alive? The past itself? Or the people who refuse to let the past die? Because perhaps the central tragedy is not that human beings make mistakes. Perhaps the greater tragedy is that societies often become emotionally invested in those mistakes remaining permanent. And if that is true, then Jean Valjean's significance becomes even larger. He is no longer simply a redeemed man. He becomes evidence. Evidence that identity may be less solid than we imagine. Evidence that a human life can move in a direction that history did not predict. But that revelation creates an even more unsettling question. If transformation is real, and if people are genuinely capable of becoming someone new, then why do so many individuals fight so hard to preserve the identities they claim to hate? And why do entire systems sometimes seem more comfortable with a familiar failure than with an unpredictable transformation? What if the deepest transformation in Les Misérables has nothing to do with morality at all? What if the real revelation is that Jean Valjean does not merely challenge society's opinion of him, but challenges one of the oldest assumptions human beings have ever made about themselves? Up to this point, the conflict appears to revolve around identity. Can a person escape a label? Can a human being outgrow a past? But beneath those questions lies something even more fundamental. A hidden assumption. An invisible rule. The assumption that character is something discovered rather than created. Most people live as if identity is an archaeological project. They dig into the past searching for who they really are. Victor Hugo quietly proposes something radically different. What if identity is not discovered? What if it is built? What if the most important question is not who are you, but who are you becoming? That shift changes everything. Suddenly Jean Valjean's role becomes much larger than that of a redeemed individual. He becomes a living contradiction to the idea that human beings possess a fixed essence. His influence extends beyond morality and enters philosophy itself. Because if a person can consciously become something new, then the self is not a monument. It is a construction site. And that insight introduces a profound paradox. People often claim they want freedom. Yet genuine transformation is one of the most frightening forms of freedom imaginable. Why? Because the moment you accept that change is possible, excuses begin to disappear. The prison of the past may be painful, but it is predictable. Transformation demands uncertainty. Transformation demands responsibility. Transformation demands that a person stop asking what happened to them and begin asking what they will do next. This is where one of the most powerful symbols in the entire story begins to reveal its deeper meaning. Think about the recurring image of a name. Not merely a collection of letters. A name as a container. A vessel carrying history, reputation, judgment, expectation. Society treats names as permanent records. But life continuously rebels against permanence. The name remains. The person evolves. The record remains. The consciousness changes. The label remains. The soul moves forward. Here the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Civilization depends on stable categories, yet human growth depends on transcending categories. One force creates order. The other creates possibility. Neither can fully eliminate the other. And that tension does not exist only inside a novel. It exists inside every family, every institution, every generation. It exists anywhere people try to decide whether another human being should be defined by who they were or who they might become. This is why the story continues to resonate long after its historical setting has faded. Its true subject is not poverty, law, punishment, or even redemption. Its true subject is potential. The possibility that a human life contains more than its current form reveals. A memory fragment emerges from that realization. A name carved into stone can survive for centuries. Yet a living human being can become someone entirely different in a fraction of that time. Which raises a revelation that is both liberating and deeply unsettling. If transformation is the highest expression of human potential, then perhaps the greatest obstacle was never society's judgment alone. Perhaps the deeper obstacle is that part of ourselves that still seeks safety in an identity we have already outgrown. And if that is true, then the central conflict is about to become much larger than a struggle between one man and one system. It becomes a conflict between two competing visions of what a human being actually is. If the deepest obstacle is not society alone, and not even the past itself, then what is Jean Valjean actually proving? This is where the central revelation of the entire story finally comes into focus. Most readers assume the novel is ultimately about redemption. Others believe it is about justice, compassion, poverty, or forgiveness. Those themes are certainly present. But they are not the deepest layer. The deeper layer is hidden beneath all of them. Victor Hugo is asking a far more dangerous question: what if the defining feature of a human being is not character, status, intelligence, success, morality, or even history? What if the defining feature is the capacity for self-transcendence? Suddenly everything rearranges itself. Jean Valjean's importance is no longer found in what he becomes. It is found in the fact that he becomes at all. His role is not to serve as an example of goodness. His role is to serve as proof that human identity is fundamentally unfinished. That distinction changes the entire meaning of the story. Because an unfinished being is not trapped by current limitations. An unfinished being contains unrealized possibilities. An unfinished being cannot be fully explained by past events. This is why the most important symbol in the story is not a courtroom, a prison, a city, or even a specific person. The most important symbol is transformation itself. Transformation becomes the invisible force moving beneath every conflict. It is the current beneath the surface. The silent challenge directed at every system that depends upon permanence. And here the deepest contradiction finally reveals itself. Human civilization requires stability, yet human flourishing requires change. Society wants predictability. Growth requires unpredictability. Institutions preserve identity. Transformation disrupts identity. Neither side can fully eliminate the other. The tension is permanent. That is why the conflict resonates far beyond literature. Every parent eventually faces it. Every teacher faces it. Every judge faces it. Every leader faces it. Every individual faces it when looking into the mirror and deciding whether yesterday's version of themselves deserves authority over tomorrow's possibilities. A new memory fragment emerges here. Imagine two doors standing side by side. One door is labeled certainty. The other is labeled transformation. Most people believe they can walk through both at the same time. They cannot. Every genuine transformation requires abandoning some certainty about who you think you are. That is the hidden cost. That is the sacrifice people often overlook. Jean Valjean's legacy is not kindness. Kindness is visible. Transformation is invisible. Kindness is an action. Transformation is a reconstruction of being. Kindness can happen in a moment. Transformation can redefine an entire life. The consequence of this revelation becomes enormous once we expand the scale. If human beings are defined by their capacity for self-transcendence, then societies built entirely on fixed identities are misunderstanding something essential about human nature. More importantly, individuals who define themselves solely through past failures may be participating in the same mistake. The prison becomes psychological. The sentence becomes internal. The walls become invisible. And perhaps this is why the story continues to feel modern despite the passage of time. It is not describing a historical problem. It is describing a permanent human condition. The struggle between who we have been and who we might become. Yet this revelation creates a consequence that is even larger and more unsettling. If transformation is the highest expression of human potential, then what responsibility do we have toward people who are still changing? And what happens to a civilization when it loses faith in transformation itself? The moment we accept that transformation may be the highest expression of human potential, an unavoidable consequence emerges. The question is no longer whether change is possible. The question becomes what happens after it occurs. Because transformation does not erase consequences. It does not rewind time. It does not remove scars. In many ways, the greatest price is paid after the transformation, not before it. This is one of the most overlooked insights hidden within the legacy of Jean Valjean. The reward for becoming someone new is not certainty. It is responsibility. Once a person recognizes that identity is not fixed, they lose the comfort of believing that the future is predetermined. Every choice becomes meaningful. Every action becomes a declaration of who they are becoming. That burden is heavier than many people realize. It is easier to blame the past than to build a future. It is easier to inherit an identity than to create one. This is why the legacy of Jean Valjean extends far beyond literature. His influence does not survive because he represents moral perfection. It survives because he embodies a difficult truth about human development. Transformation is not an event. It is maintenance. It is not a destination. It is a continuous act of construction. A civilization faces the same challenge. Institutions often imagine that progress happens through laws, policies, technologies, and systems. Those things matter. But beneath them lies a more fragile foundation. A civilization can only evolve if enough people believe that human beings are capable of evolving. The moment that belief disappears, stagnation begins. Not because innovation vanishes, but because hope vanishes. And when hope disappears, every category hardens. Every label becomes permanent. Every mistake becomes a verdict. A powerful memory fragment emerges here. Imagine a bridge suspended over a deep canyon. On one side stands the person you have been. On the other side stands the person you could become. The bridge itself is invisible. It is built entirely from choices. Every day you either strengthen it or allow it to decay. That image captures the deeper legacy of the story. The bridge is never finished. The crossing is never complete. This is why the conflict remains relevant in the modern world. Social media profiles preserve old versions of people. Search engines preserve old mistakes. Institutions store records. Communities remember failures. Technology has become extraordinarily good at remembering. Yet human growth often depends upon the ability to move beyond what has been remembered. The tension grows stronger every year. The consequence is not merely personal. It becomes cultural. Entire societies begin to face a difficult dilemma. How do you preserve accountability without destroying the possibility of renewal? How do you remember the past without becoming imprisoned by it? How do you create justice without accidentally eliminating mercy? These questions have no easy answers. That is precisely why the story continues to endure. Not because it resolves the tension, but because it exposes it. The legacy of Jean Valjean is ultimately not a lesson. It is a challenge. A challenge directed toward every generation. A challenge directed toward every institution. A challenge directed toward every individual staring at an old version of themselves and wondering whether change is still possible. And yet an even deeper mystery remains unresolved. If human beings possess the extraordinary capacity to become more than they once were, why do so many people instinctively trust permanence more than possibility? Why does the idea of transformation inspire hope in some hearts and fear in others? And perhaps most importantly, what does that reveal about the future of any civilization that gradually loses faith in the human capacity to change? Perhaps that is why Les Misérables refuses to fade into the past. Not because it provides answers, but because it leaves us standing before a question that every generation must confront again for itself. Over time, details change. Governments change. Technologies change. Economies rise and fall. Entire social orders disappear. Yet one tension remains remarkably constant. Human beings continue to struggle between what they have been and what they might become. And that is where the lasting significance of Jean Valjean truly resides. His legacy is not contained within a particular century, a particular country, or even a particular story. His legacy survives because he represents something that exists inside almost every person, the possibility that the future does not have to be a repetition of the past. What makes this idea so powerful is not its optimism. It is its difficulty. We often imagine that hope is comforting. In reality, genuine hope can be deeply demanding. Because the moment you believe change is possible, you must also accept responsibility for what comes next. The future is no longer something that merely happens to you. It becomes something you help create. That realization transforms the entire meaning of human life. A memory fragment lingers here. Not a prison. Not a courtroom. Not a record. Imagine instead a candle in a dark room. The candle does not erase the darkness. It does not rewrite history. It does not deny what came before. It simply proves that another reality is possible. That image captures something essential about the human condition. The most important transformations often begin long before the world recognizes them. Long before institutions acknowledge them. Long before other people believe them. Sometimes they begin in complete silence, inside a decision that nobody else can see. This is why the story ultimately reaches beyond questions of morality, law, or social status. It becomes a meditation on human dignity itself. Not dignity as something granted by society. Not dignity as something earned through perfection. But dignity as something connected to the uniquely human capacity to grow beyond previous limitations. And perhaps that is the deepest reason the conflict still matters. Every culture creates labels. Every era creates categories. Every generation invents new ways of sorting people into fixed identities. Yet life itself continually pushes against those boundaries. Human beings remain more complicated than the systems designed to define them. More fluid than the stories told about them. More unfinished than they appear. The paradox is impossible to escape. We need memory in order to preserve meaning. Yet we also need the possibility of transformation in order to preserve hope. Remove memory, and responsibility disappears. Remove transformation, and the future disappears. The tension can never be solved completely. It can only be navigated. And perhaps that is the final insight Victor Hugo leaves behind. The question was never whether a person can become better. The deeper question is whether we are willing to see human beings as unfinished works rather than completed judgments. Because the answer to that question shapes far more than individual lives. It shapes families, communities, institutions, entire civilizations. And maybe the most important thing to remember is this: the strongest chains are rarely made of iron. They are made of certainty. Certainty about who someone was. Certainty about who someone is. Certainty about who someone will always be. But if human beings are truly unfinished, then certainty itself may be the illusion. And if that is true, then perhaps the question that remains after everything else has been said is not whether people can change. Perhaps the real question is whether we possess the wisdom, the courage, and the humility to leave room for that change when it comes.